My name is Adrian. I have the great honor of moderating the last panel titled Method. And so my job here is just to read a couple bios, keep some time, and get out of the way. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. All right. And I'll do it in the order of our presenters this afternoon. So the first person presenting is Ashon Crawley. He's going to be on Zoom with us. Ashon Crawley is a writer, artist, and teacher exploring the intersection of performance, Blackness, queerness, and spirituality. He moves in and out of multiple genres in order to sound out a critique of the normative world, to sound out the possibility for alternatives for otherwise. He is the Associate Professor of Religious Studies and African American and African Studies at the University of Virginia, and is author of Black Pentecostal Breath, The Aesthetics of Possibility, and The Lonely Letters. As founder of the Otherwise Arts Lab, an integrative arts practice in space, Crawley brings together scholars, artists, musicians, and community members to exchange ideas, concepts, and practices. He has been granted fellowships with Yaddo, McDowell, New City Arts Initiative, and Gilead Compass Faith Coordinating Center. His audiovisual art has been featured at Second Street Gallery, Welcome Gallery, Bridge Projects, and the California African American Museum. He'll be presenting Between Lyrics and Rhythms, Musicians and Friends. The second presenter, Henry Washington Jr., will be presenting Put a Little Growl in It, the transcendent promise of gospel, prose, and the dissonant vocality of Twinkie Clark. Henry Washington Jr. is an interdisciplinary scholar of race, gender, and aesthetics in the post-slavery United States, and an assistant professor of feminist, gender, and sexuality studies at Wesleyan University. His research and teaching draw on the methods of literary criticism, performance theory, visual cultural analysis, and Black feminist and trans theories to examine how dominant regimes of knowledge construct and maintain difference to justify uneven distributions of power that would otherwise betray the West's performance of democracy. And last but certainly not least, we have Eboni Marshall Turman, who will be presenting There Shall Be a Performance, Racialized Gender, Contested Agency, and the Aesthetics of Power in the Clark Sisters. A little bit of Dr. Turman's bio. She's the Associate Professor of Theology and African American Religion at Yale University Divinity School, a first career concert dancer, an ordained National Baptist preacher. Her research interests span the varieties of 20th century US theological liberalisms, most especially Black and womanist theological, social, ethical, and theoaesthetic traditions. She co-chairs the Black Theology Unit of the American Academy of Religion, is an executive board member of the Society of Christian Ethics, and a founding member of the Black Church Collective, for which she served as lead author of the recent quote, "On Black Lives Matter, a theological statement from the Black churches." Dr. Turman is currently completing her second monograph, tentatively entitled, quote, "Black Women's Burden, Male Power, Gender, Violence, and the Scandal of African-American Social Christianity." And she has recently begun preliminary research for her third monograph titled, "In My Flesh Shall I See God, Black Womanist Theological Aesthetics." So without further ado, I will leave us with Ashon first.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for letting me be virtual. To Professor Braxton Shelley, I will just join with everyone else that has said they are proud of you. I am too proud of you. I remember when I was a graduate student at Duke University, and you were an undergraduate at Duke University, and to see your progression since that time has been really, really lovely. I'm really thankful for the invitation to join the conversation today and to share some of the work that I've been sort of thinking through for a very long time. And thank you for the flexibility too. I have been having probably one of the most difficult semesters of my professional life. It's been just a lot going on. And so at the very last minute, I had to cancel my flight, but I still wanted to be a part. So I'm glad that I could be here. This talk is very short. I wrote that it's very short. We'll see. It's from my ongoing research into the Hammond organ and the practice of musicianship in the Black church. I was at the Institute of Sacred Music from 2018 to 2019. So hello to everybody. It's nice to see you all virtually. And I was researching what I thought at that time would become the book Made Instrument, from which I'm presenting today. We had a symposium about the Hammond organ. Professor Shelley, who was at Harvard at the time, was one of the speakers for that. Fredara Hadley was also one of the speakers who, she's a professor at Juilliard. And she did a presentation, and at the end of her presentation said that she was very happy that some of the presentations were talking intentionally about queer people and the relation to the Black church and to the Hammond organ, because she said in her words that she had grown up in the 80s and 90s, and a lot of musicians had died of AIDS complications, and there was never really a real conversation about that. And once she said that, it changed the trajectory of the book project, so much so that I really have formed it differently based on that. Having grown up in the Church of God in Christ, I was keenly aware of the Hammond's force and power. But playing an instrument is not just about a mechanical fact, it's also about a social practice. And so what I'm trying to present today is based on Made Instrument, in which a book in which I tracked the history of the AIDS crisis between 1980 and 2005, and how it then and still does impact the Black church, but also a prehistory of the conditions that contributed to the crisis, and how the Black church's hesitance and at times violent response to it was precipitated before 1980. And so the talk title changed, if you can see, Renunciation, Lyrics and Rhythm, Musicians and Friends. Renunciation is the general problem of our moment, of this long historical post-1492 temporal measure, because renunciation names the force and the form of imagining possibility and relation, and after having imagined it, refusing that possibility. Because what did it mean for a navigator from Genoa, Italy, to perform a series of expeditions to a so-called New World that he thought was the Indies, and after having arrived and having encountered difference, deemed the people insufficient and deficient? It at least meant that the people encountered were not Christian, and thus meant that their land was able to be taken, stolen, their people were available to harm and exploitation. What could have been the possibility for relation, the imagining being in communion and learning from one another with no other goal than being in communion with difference, instead took learning as a practice of the political economy, a political economy that is based on exploitation, violence, and harm. To encounter difference and to register that difference as insufficient, as a problem to remediate and remove, is our present condition. We've been here a long time doing this thing, refusing one another, refusing care, and refusing friendship. And then I jump. In 1972, the same year that Motown closed their Detroit operation, 2 years before Detroit elected their first Black mayor, Bailey Temple Church of God in Christ, a Black Pentecostal congregation founded in 1926 by John Seth and his wife, Anna J. Bailey, relocated to the former Adat Shalom Synagogue in the University District of Detroit. They, John Seth and Anna J., began in the house and the basement in 1926. They felt moved by the Spirit to begin a congregation. The Church of God in Christ was still new, began in 1896, so just 30 years from the moment's operation. But like many in the organization at the time, they felt called and heeded the call. They were able to have worship at a storefront church until 1972, when they purchased a former synagogue. Detroit, Michigan, the city had been through a lot of political unrest, and the rebellions that some call riots that were fundamentally about economic inequality, police violence, and misleadership of the political class kept happening. White people in the city had become increasingly uncomfortable with Black people moving into formerly red line zoned segregated areas. And though white flight began as early as the 1950s, it was not until after 1967, after the 1967 rebellions, that a major movement of white people relocated to the suburbs. But how does white flight happen? White flight is a colloquialism that imprecisely names the violence of settler colonialism, its movement and force throughout various lands. White flight is really an economic and political condition of renouncing relationship, renunciation. And in Detroit in 1950 and onward, we can think about white flight as the renouncing of relation to Black people in the same way that the silence regarding the AIDS crisis eviscerating the Black church is a renunciation of Black queer people, about which I'll say more soon. Detroit was known for its sound, the Motown sound. Motown because it was known as the Motor City, home to Chrysler, Ford, Cadillac, and others. Labor and political economic forces are named and claimed with the word Motown. Quote, the rebuilding of the center of Detroit beginning in 1967 as a response to the rebellion there proposed by the new Detroit Committee would mean that eventually Blacks, Appalachians, and students who inhabited the area between the Riverfront Commercial Center and the Wayne State University area would be removed to make room for a revitalized city repopulated by middle and upper class representatives of the city's various racial and ethnic groups. And in the first 6 years of the new Detroit Committee's existence, the quality of life in the city deteriorated to a new low. The industrial workers who made up more than 35% of the population were the hardest hit. They found that the new Detroit meant working longer hours, faster, paying higher taxes in exchange for diminishing city services and for wage gains more than outpaced by inflation. Black workers continued to hold the most arduous, dangerous, and unhealthy jobs. Their move toward job improvement, union office, and shop floor reform were resisted by the companies, the unions, and even their fellow workers. The Black population bore most of the burden of the curtailed public services, especially the nearly non-existent public transportation system and the school system on the verge of bankruptcy. This impact on Black workers and the Black population should have been an ethical crisis, but it did not register as such. And it's because the violence against Black folks was precipitated by several colonial violence that removed Indigenous people from the land first, and then forced Jewish people into the neighborhoods, and then forced those people out with white flight. Such that the sounding out of the city, whatever that sound might be, could be considered to be an elaboration on and commentary about the crisis that was existing that did not attend to or care about Black people. And perhaps it was not a crisis too, because there was exploitation of Black genius. I'm eternally grateful to Amber Dromgoole for posting an article on Twitter that gave me what I've been looking for, but I could not find. In an article titled "To Honor a Church Worker," published by the Michigan Chronicle, November 21st, 1964, was a celebration about Dr. Mattie Moss Clark. It states, quote, "For more than 9 years, she directed and played the organ for the Founders Choir of the Cadillac Company." In the same periodical, the next year, November 6, 1965, it says, quote, "Mrs. Clark also trained the Cadillac Foundry Chorus of Detroit," end quote. What I'd been after was a way to link the labor practices that were happening in Detroit, the struggles for equality on the shop floors, and the Black church through the Hammond organ. I've been looking and looking and looking and couldn't find anything. And then my dear friend posted this article. What remains for me to figure out and to investigate are the ways the training of these choirs and the usage of her musicality and the musicality of the Black church more generally became a way to be dismissive of Black workers. Because there was, at the same time as she is directing choirs in 1955, a sharp uptick in Black labor that was working during World War II that was now fired because of labor shortages once the war ended in 1945, such that many people who were working for these motor companies were also being fired at the same time that they're now producing these choirs. This is for me to figure out, In other words, is this a predecessor to diversity, equity, and inclusion measures that created opportunities for some at the expense of the masses? But to return to the conversation. Bailey Cathedral would eventually become in 1979 the location where one of the most important Black Pentecostal music albums and most important gospel albums, the Clark Sisters' Is My Living in Vain, would be recorded. Sister Elbonita Twinkie Clark's skilled musicianship on the Hammond organ was an anchor for the album's popularity. With the Clark Sisters recording, one hears the density of the space when there is abandonment and reanimation of sound, when there is the leaving and arrival, the breaking away from and coming back to of instruments. To transform such a force of testimony, song, shout, happiness, and dance into otherwise modality, otherwise feel. It was felt in the ways that they gathered up the crisis that was happening in Detroit as a way to actually produce song. Bailey Cathedral is exemplary of the problem of renunciation. The built environment and its repurposing has much to teach us, because we learn from listening practices about the capacity of the abandoned to make things after having been renounced, for the people who have been abandoned and the spaces that have been abandoned to be reanimated with creative genius, like what the Clark Sisters do in the former Adat Shalom, Temple Adat Shalom. And so what we have are the sounds of a critique of settler colonialism that made the abandonment of the city even possible. But I'm also interested in thinking about how white flight, which is another way to say renunciation, is also evident in the Black church, an internal logic that had us turn on one another. And Detroit gives me a way to think about renunciation as a problem when we train our attention to the 1980s, to the 90s, and to the 2000s. What happened in Detroit in the 1980s and 90s? There was so much uncertainty. In 1989, for example, when I was 9 years old, in Detroit, there were 503 HIV diagnoses, 175 deaths, 302 AIDS diagnoses, and 167 deaths. And approximately 27% of the new cases were Black people in the city of Detroit that 1 year alone. Yet there were also songs written by people like Marvin Winans, The Word of God, and recorded at Greater Grace Cathedral, another church in Detroit, Michigan, that lamented the fact that in 1989, there was a time when one could be guaranteed that you knew that a man was a man and a woman was a woman. But now there is laughter at the idea that there's all of this indeterminacy. The worry over queerness erases so much. It erases by producing the renunciation of queerness, and it ends up eliminating various kinds of narratives.
Every musician tried to get a little bit of Tommy in their music. Even myself, right, Gwen? And one time we were just joking with each other. He said, Twinkie, can you hear that little Clark influence in my music? I said, yeah, Tommy, but can you hear the little Tommy effect in mine? So I thank God that we were able to share musically in the ministry together. And one song that influenced me to kind of put that style in my music was I Tried Him and I Know Him, and I just like to do a line. He had this unique style that I hadn't heard other gospel musicians do, and that is putting words and phrasing out of the normal timing. So if you didn't have rhythm, you couldn't flow with that beat. Lift your hands up and say, I'm going home. He saved my soul, and he made me whole. There's none like him. I kind of got that. He saved my soul, and he made me whole. There's none like him. Oh.
I hope y'all could hear that, but this is the funeral for Thomas Whitfield, a musician from Detroit, Michigan. Very, very, very important musician from Detroit, Michigan, who's a dear friend of Twinkie Clark. There's a deep intimacy in the creation of and breaking with the concept of genius. Musical genius is not the practice of individuals. Rather, paying attention to the way Twinkie Clark talks about her own musicianship practice, we might consider musical genius to be the compression and eventual expression of the social world that make individuals possible. And I have wanted a way to think about the form that Twinkie's musicianship takes. Thomas Whitfield was her friend, fellow Detroit musician who died in 1992 of various complications at the age of 38. What she says in the clip is that one thing she learned from Thomas Whitfield is a method for separating out the rhythm of the lyric from the rhythm of the instrumentation. And it wasn't until hearing her description of her now deceased friend that I was able to understand his musicality and genius and quality. We hear it in the way they sing, there's none, or the way she sings, there's none like him at the end of the phrase. It doesn't match the beat and it doesn't have to. It can become a moment to dance and play and improvise. The space between the rhythm of the lyric and the rhythm of the instrumentation is the space in which worlds of possibility are imagined and enacted. And here's an example of Thomas Whitfield actually writing that kind of movement for a choir.
I don't know what the future may hold for me. I don't even know if I'll ever really be set free. But there's one thing I know. I never seen the righteous forsaken yet.
Renunciation is the problem of our current order. And I argue that a certain glib response to the AIDS crisis is one way that we can sense renunciation of friendship, the renunciation of care, and the renunciation of possibility, and the renunciation of the musical genius that could have been created had we not renounced one another in the process of trying to renounce one another. So many sermons in the 80s and 90s were about the problem and crisis of queerness supposedly infiltrating the church. Everyone from Clay Evans to evangelist Francis Kelly, and too many others to name. But this renunciation actually functioned more than just a general unkindness to musicians, choir directors, and singers directly impacted by the health crisis, because there was also the making invisible of labor, work, and relations. Just really quickly, one of the things I'm trying to show in these advertisements are from the New York Amsterdam News. I was doing research trying to just find anything that had been written about the Black church and the AIDS crisis in newspapers. And I kept coming across advertisements, and what the advertisements were the sections of the newspapers, the jobs ads. And I kept finding all of these ads for church organists that were right next to ads for organizations looking for people to work with people living with HIV and dying of AIDS complications. And in this particular image, you see dedicated musician, organist, or pianist needed for a Baptist church in Brooklyn, young or middle-aged woman preferred. This is 1992. So at the height of the AIDS crisis, you have churches saying, we want women specifically. Anytime I present work, I'm almost done. Anytime I present work, people would ask me about women musicians like Twinkie Clark, like Maddie Moss Clark, because I always talk about men who died of AIDS complications. They'd ask me about Kitty Parham, Lavonia Whitley. They would ask me about women that remind me of my own teacher, Yolanda Grice, her sister, Nina Grice from New Jersey. All of these people are geniuses that were responsible for teaching so many how to play the instrument, geniuses that were foundational for the way so many of us who are not women learned how to be effective on the Hammond organist, who knew how to be effective for congregations. So many of us in the Church of God in Christ and other denominations listened to the way Twinkie played in order to learn her facility with the instrument. And so many of us took lessons, even if initially from women musicians. Many others made space for us to learn and practice in churches during church services and would help us and promote us when we got better. But they are often invisibilized, often in discussion about the Hammond organ in the Black church. Listening to Twinkie honor her friend Tommy at the time of his death and funeral service moved me and made me understand something. The deaths of the musicians in the 80s and 90s, deaths which remain with us today, and also precipitate the death from COVID that we don't often talk about, that we haven't grieved properly, I don't think. Deaths that remain with us because so many of the musicians that died wrote songs that are still learned today in choir rehearsal and sung in churches on Sundays. They became the point of contention because it made the queerness of the Black church explicit. And rather than thinking about this as a health crisis and a failure of local, state, and federal governments to enact healthcare policies that would give resources for care and comfort, the deaths were internalized by many in the Black church as a personal and moral ethical failure of the ones who are the victim of the virus. This then means that there was not only a mischaracterization of queerness in the Black church as only belonging to men, but more fundamentally than that, there was the erasure of the contribution that women made possible, because AIDS was first considered to be a white disease, and then a white gay man disease, and then just a gay disease. Because the response to that health crisis was to point the fault at the individuals who were actually being impacted by the health crisis, such that all of the attention and the worry over what can we do about the fact of queerness meant to focus on manhood and masculinity and making the music department, specifically men, more masculine. But this then means that we don't pay attention to the women who are laboring for us, women who are actually producing the musical genius, folks like Twinkie Clark. Musicianship gets rewritten as a masculinist and manly profession precisely because of the deaths of these musicians, because some come to think about the need for music to be a space of recovery of an over manliness. It's why you get a different sounding sound, a different kind of gospel sound around about 1996. And perhaps it's too why we forget that Jenny Seymour, the wife of William Seymour before she married him, testified to being filled with the Spirit in 1906, and that the filling of Spirit meant for her to walk to the piano and to play the piano for the congregation. She had never played the piano before, and the saints testified that it was heavenly music. What remains necessary is a reckoning, and taking seriously the intellectual tradition of musicianship, of which Mattie Moss Clark perhaps inaugurated and participated, and of which Twinkie too inaugurates and participates, is one way to get toward that reckoning. But after reckoning, there will also be the necessity for repair. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Does this clicker work for that? Okay. Great. Okay, thank you. Hi, everybody. Let me first join in, this resounding chorus singing Professor Braxton Shelley's praises. He is largely responsible for our gathering here. I'm very grateful for that.
Also, I'm just so excited to be in conversation with the other speakers. As to not delay time, I will hop right into it. Okay, so can you all hear me pretty well? Okay, I'll move it a little closer. Okay. That doesn't seem entirely possible, but can you hear me better? Okay, great. Okay. I have organized my talk around a video from November 1994, just 2 months after the death of gospel legend, Dr. Mattie Moss Clark. In this video, her daughter Twinkie, the brilliant composer, writer, and artistic visionary of the Clark sisters, attempts to perform the song Tried Him and I Know Him as a solo. Twinkie had been a featured artist and vocalist on the song's 1986 recording from the album Dr. Mattie Moss Clark Presents the Southern California Holy Gospel Music Workshop. But in this clip, Twinkie's palpable pain undermines her ability to perform with her characteristic virtuoso. Twinkie's sadness emerges from the fact that as she sings in the song's melody toward the performance's end, "Mama ain't here to answer me." The absence of her mother, with whom she had led the song countless times as a duet, leaves Twinkie unable to hit her marks. As anyone who has heard her perform will know, Twinkie is an extraordinarily gifted vocalist, even which we heard today, right? But here, the cry in her voice bends the top end of her high notes. The growl and the rasp she routinely marshals in order to help convey a lyric's meaning here occur, but at times feel more like obstacles extending from her grief than interpretive strategies. My title is taken from another performance, which we actually heard earlier in Professor Ramsey's presentation, the live recording of Twinkie's sermonette from the 1996 album, Twinkie Clark Terrell Presents the Florida A&M University Gospel Choir. The last track on the album, the recording features a call and response between Twinkie and the audience. In a final and conclusive way, Twinkie leads the audience in collectively confronting the reality of life's struggles in the natural world with the performative possibility through which gospel promises spiritual overcoming. Braxton D. Shelley has argued that the gospel genre's, quote, characteristic linkage of words and music, sound and belief routinely facilitate embodied religious experience. If the gospel performance is distinguished by the communal poetics through which Shelley argues this process is performed, the composition and placement of Twinkie's sermonette on the album exemplifies the utility of this collective phenomenon as a practice of transcendent meaning making. So I'm just gonna play it for us again.
Are you going all the way? All the way, all the way. Look at somebody and say, I am determined. At this time, I want you to put a little growl in it and think about what you've been through. Think about all your pain and your disappointment. And put a little growl in it. Just make the devil mad for a minute and say, I am determined. Somebody said that a woman ain't supposed to do that. A woman ain't supposed to holler and put all that growl in there. But if you've been through some frustration and some pain, and you crying out to God, you laying before him, you ain't gonna be cute with it. You're gonna say, Lord.
I want to think through the growl as it appears in both of these contexts to consider, on the one hand, the transcendent promise of gospel's message that the nexus of words and music, sound and belief facilitates, and on the other hand, what I will argue is Twinkie Clark's dissonant vocality. In line with literary scholar Dana Luciano's interest in what she calls the deployment of the feeling body as the index of a temporality apart from the linear paradigm of progress, the dissonant vocality I describe resituates hearers in the felt experience of the Black female body in pain, thereby disrupting gospel music's redemptive telos. In the broader book project, Luciano historicizes the emergence of a particular white Enlightenment orientation toward the religious afterlife. She says that this orientation helped to order the chaos of grief in 19th century American culture amidst a progressive project of nation building and global regeneration. There was an insistence in this period on modernity's time as linear and ordered, progressive and teleological, that the promise of future union with the past on helped to strengthen. But as the white middle class family cultivated this sensibility toward death, Black mourning practices were reproduced as spiritually primitive, their sheer duration made to signify an inability to adjust to what we might call the time of normative citizenship. This included Black Americans' will to reckon with, rather than merely move on from, the violence of slavery. Although Luciano's period of focus predates the historical emergence of what we now call modern gospel music, her work generatively speaks to the pathologization of Black mourning and Black feeling more generally that has consistently served as an alibi for anti-Black violence under modernity. The work also speaks to the utility of the feeling body as an intervention into modernity's temporality of progress. This sense which ensures that whenever and wherever anti-Black violence appears, it should merely be moved past rather than reckoned with. In the context of Twinkie's performative repertoire, I want to suggest that her growls, grunts, moans, and other acts of this gritty interpretive vocality are acts of labor that constitute an intervention into this genre's sort of time of transcendence. In this video, they do so through giving form to Twinkie's grief, particularly in its refusal to be quieted by the Christian promise of reunion with her mother in the afterlife. Twinkie's audience is forced to sit in and to tarry with the pain that endures from her mother's death, despite this assurance of religious possibility. Although we might argue that the gospel genre's message of redemption was only ever anticipatory, that is, that it expects and singer's hope calls into being the hoped for, although not yet here, promises of God. The growl and the rasp remind us that the feeling body suffers right now in an anti-Black world and deserves to be attended to rather than silenced with promises of resolution. Dr. Clark's death leaves this present absence that Recalling Joseph Roach's investigations of surrogation, the community endeavors to fill, but fails. But I also want to suggest that the growl, the holler, the squall, and related interpretive techniques are used to similar ends by Twinkie Clark, even in performances where she marshals them with more intention. That perhaps Black gospel performers and Black women gospel performers in particular have adapted an aesthetics of suffering that troubles the temporality of progress implied in gospel's lyrics. Thus, I want to suggest that the unusual failure at mastery conveyed in Twinkie's more unruly and unrestrained growls throughout the Tried Him and I Know Him performance invites us to rethink these vocal techniques as they appear throughout her entire corpus, and perhaps elsewhere in the gospel performance repertoire. And further, that these aesthetic gestures' recurrence invites us to consider a number of questions. What do we do with the apparent fact that at times the interplay between gospel's music and gospel's message fails to lift a sufferer out of her agony? What happens when the music's assurance of redemption is, for its performers or for its audiences, unimaginable, even if those performers or audiences are themselves believers? In a genre wherein pain is ordinarily only invoked so that it may be eclipsed or transcended, whereas Mahalia Jackson once told a Chicago Tribune interviewer, quote, "There is a sadness, but always there is the hope and the faith in the Lord and the forgetting of sadness and trouble in praising him." The growl situates us back in the materiality of the Black woman's heartache. My objective here is not exactly to undermine the cultural or scholarly investment in gospel as a message of hope, but rather to, if only slightly, redirect our attention to the feeling body through which such messages are communicated, as well as to ask what might emerge from centering that body in our gospel music analyses. Taking those bodies' performances seriously, I argue, transports us to a different temporal register than mere recourse to the genre's lyrical content. In this performance, for instance, the feeling body sings words about, but cannot fully embody transformation. And I should also say that a part of how I arrive at thinking in these ways is precisely because of sudden deaths in my family recently, right? Where there's this sort of intensity or gravity of grief that, right, the message of gospel's hope, as strong as my family's faith is, just simply could not hold at certain times. Okay, this is from the end of this performance, the end of the video. I'm just so struck by this image, right? That she is singing this message of hope, and yet by the end of the performance, she is still clearly in pain. And so building on, but slightly departing from Professor Shelley's interest in the harmony of music and message in the gospel performance repertoire, I am proposing that we might use Twinkie's performance as a starting point for thinking through an aesthetics of gospel vocality that actually contradicts the genre's insistent lyrical promises of redemption. The words to Tried Him and I Know Him, which testify that he saved my soul, he made me whole, designate transcendence. The song's primary narrator, embodied in the voice of the song's leader or leaders, recounts their own experiences of having discovered God's power in an implicit appeal to those who feel lonely or downtrodden. The collective performance, the communal poetics about which Professor Shelley speaks, is meant to do the work of bridging the gap between past positive experience with God, present needs, and future resolution. But by the end of the performance, as we see, Twinkie is emotionally and physically just where she began. To put a little growl in it is for me to disrupt the linear trajectory toward resolution the genre's message and method are intent on modeling through collective performance. The growl and the rasp testify to the unruliness with which pain and absence often linger in the time of grief. To put a little growl in it then is to complicate the temporality of gospel's narrative of progress generally, but it is also to trouble the uses to which Black women's bodies have been put in order to make that narrative coherent. As Farah Jasmine Griffin has shown, quote, this figure of the singing Black woman is often similar to the uses of Black women's bodies as nurturing, healing, life, and love-giving for the majority culture. And even in the intramural context of the Black church, as others have noted today, Black women have been both the largest demographic, whose labor is the most extracted, and simultaneously the most overlooked or underheard, those whose feelings are consistently deprioritized. The growl and the rasp, even as part of the labor of gospel music, models a different way of thinking. It redirects our attention to the materiality of that feeling body and the dynamism of that feeling which might not always neatly align with gospel's lyrical messages of hope. The potentiality in these aesthetic practices is not quite what Ashon Crawley discusses as otherwise possibility in his essential text on Black Pentecostalism as an aesthetic practice and mode of collectivity. Otherwise is for him, oh, I lost one of my slides, so we're gonna just imagine that this has Professor Crawley's excerpt here. But otherwise is for him a kind of political potentiality in Black Pentecostal performance, whereby, quote, the resource for critiquing the ways sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and classism inform the world exist within the world itself, end quote. The growl and the rasp, I am suggesting, are not about modeling alternative modes of social organization and mobilization that might materialize in an other world necessarily, but rather about sitting with the pain engendered by the felt impossibilities of the here and now. And indeed, the growl attests to the interior possibilities of the aesthetic, not as resistance to the normative order, but as the creation of space to sit in disappointment without the demand that it always or immediately be resolved. By way of conclusion, I want to suggest that reorienting our attention to the feeling body in gospel music performance, as I have suggested we do today, might reshape how we think about gospel as a cultural artifact of Black political history. And see, I lost more than one slide, my God. But as Daphne Brooks has argued of Black women artists in popular music, Black women gospel artists have certainly functioned as archives, quote, as the innovators of performances and recordings that stood in for and as the memory of a people, end quote. But perhaps their performative techniques encourage us to think of them as archives of feeling beyond archives of resistance, as engaging in a process of collective witness rather than realizing a telos of collective transcendence. Even beyond the concern with individual mourning I locate in Twinkie's Tried Him and I Know Him performance, Claudrina Harold has noted that the Clark sisters, among several of their other Detroit-born gospel contemporaries, produced music that was intimately concerned with the pressing social and political issues of Black post-industrial America. Perhaps then Twinkie's growl might help us to get closer to a gospel aesthetics that attests to the pain of a broader community. Perhaps Black aesthetic forms might be asked to do something other than perform otherwise. Thank you.
Can I just close this? Don't close it. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Protocol has been established, but I would like to acknowledge the critical work that my dear colleague Braxton Shelley has done with this symposium, as well as offer a word of gratitude for the invitation to participate, most especially alongside Dr. Crawley and Dr. Washington, these most distinguished scholars with whom I share the dais this afternoon. I am going to offer some very preliminary comments today from the subject, There Shall Be a Performance, Black Women Contested Agency and Power in the Clark Sisters. Thinking through method toward a critical assessment of the theological contributions of the Clark sisters, which, as we know, extends beyond the normative barriers of social indicators like race, gender, class, age, religious affiliation, or disaffiliation. In other words, everyone knows the Clark sisters, as has been established. They are known and renowned across genre in the music industry and within the church industrial complex. But sometimes presumed epistemological familiarity breeds erasure of what really happened. And so a critical assessment of their theological contributions must take seriously their social location as Black women. In other words, I want to contend that Black womaning is actually a primary method of the Clark sisters. We must take seriously their social location as Black women who are decidedly stitched into the heart and soul of the Black church, and more especially the Church of God in Christ, which, thinking through Kojic, has even more profound implications for a consideration of the realities of race, gender subordination, Black women's performance, and embodied power in the overarching Black Christian project. Taking Black womanism as my methodological starting point for considering Black women in the Black church, I must admit that I would be seriously overstepping ethical boundaries if I were to contend for the Clark sisters as womanists. That is not what I intend to do this afternoon. Womanism is a confessional standpoint that requires an agential self-identification in order to hold. The last thing that I want to do is endeavor to name Black women within a project that espouses the significance of Black women naming themselves. But insofar as I recognize womanism as a theological discourse that emerges from the everyday practices and everyday performances, the flesh and blood realities of Black church women and Black women in the church, I'd like to preliminarily highlight continuities between the discursive terrain of Black womanist theological methodology and the Clark sisters. Sourcing through Christian ethicists, Katie Geneva Cannon and Stacey Floyd Thomas, Black womanism identifies 4 primary tenets as the stronghold of its theological methodology: radical subjectivity, traditional communalism, redemptive self-love, and critical engagement. In short, radical subjectivity denotes the hermeneutical privilege that Black women seize for themselves within social contexts that normatively invisibilize, devalue, and/or despise them. Radical subjectivity is a primary mechanism of epistemological self-advocacy that contends for the significance, value, dignity, seriousness, boldness, responsibility, and in-chargeness of what womanist theological ethicist Emily M. Towns would call the isness of Black women. As womanist systematic theologian Ashon Crawley would contend, turning the anthropological subject to the interiority of Black women in order to make a claim about who God is and what God is doing in the world is a radical endeavor because of the compounded ways that Black women have regularly been distanced from theological inquiry, if not demonized, by the erection of white racist and patriarchal theological grammars. To say then that Black women not only have something to say about God, but even more, that their bodies, by way, in this instance, of vocacity, as it were, for the Clark sisters, typically battered and silenced by the codicil weight of systemic injustice and spiritual battery, offer evidence of the ultimate. Their bodies offer evidence of eternality, of eternal gain. It is a radical proposition, and one that is embodied with clarity in the legacy of Dr. Mattie Moss Clark, who, according to her daughters themselves, public record and witness, was serious about her craft, in charge, audacious, and willful as it related to her faith, her ministry, and the vocational trajectory of her daughters. When the Clark sisters speak of their beloved mother and how, as little girls, she would wake them up in the morning, gather them around the piano, and demand of them their voice in mid-20th century Detroit, demand of them to sing within a social milieu where the Black juvenile subject, Black children like Emmett Till, Money, Mississippi, 1955, and Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia McNair, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Wesley, Birmingham, Alabama, 1963, in a social milieu where Black children were being lynched, killed, and assaulted with impunity for walking on sidewalks, going to church, in a context where Black girls in Black churches were completely invisible, silenced, and subject to the sexual violence of spiritual predators. In this context, Mattie Moss Clark said to her little Black girls, who we now know as the Clark sisters, "Your voices are going to change the world." Methodologically construed, it was a radically subjective proposition that in some respects would come at great cost, but I'll get back to that momentarily. First, in further consideration of Black women and theological methodology, we must assess how traditional communalism, that is the impulse to care for and be attuned to an entire community beyond traditional boundaries of sameness, and with robust appreciation for the broad implications of the particular, and with a full embrace of the capacity of Black women to, echoing womanist systematic theologian Monica Coleman, and as we say in Black church vernacular, to make a way out of no way, shows up in the Clark sisters' musical witness. To be sure, Dr. Dromgoole, I am no ethnomusicologist, but what I do know is that songs like "Is My Living in Vain?", "You Brought the Sunshine," "A Praying Spirit," "Jesus is Love," "Endow Me," "I Can Do All Things Through Christ," which was my first solo in church, among the sheer brilliance of the entire catalog, represents a total shift in contemporary gospel music by ingeniously integrating elements of mainstream secular music with a quintessential kojic sound and chordal language, transgressing the boundary of church and society in such a way that not only revolutionizes the art form itself, such that there is virtually no singing woman from the early 1980s until now, Black, white, or otherwise, that has not been informed by the Clark sisters, but theologically construed in transgressing said boundary through gospel music. They also implicitly underscored, and dangerously so for kojic, the transgressive politics of a Jesus who is really concerned with everybody, saved and damned. For as he is seated at the right hand of the Father, he also holds the keys to Hades and death. I therefore contend that the Clark sisters' music implicitly uncovers a transgressive Black women's Christology that carefully attends to the both-andness of Jesus' substance, Jesus' life and ministry, at once grounded in the profundity of the human condition, that's the Stevie, and simultaneously enveloped in the divine reality, that's the Kojic sound. In a very real sense, the sonic witness of the Clark sisters gives flesh and blood to James Howe Cone's classic text on Black theological methodology, The Spirituals and the Blues, by way of their blends and melismatic singing, towing the line between traditional gospel and the mainstream, taking up, that is, a community, an entire community of hearers, both within and outside of the church, in its sheer breadth, without ever leaving the church itself, and without ever lending their voices to secular song, notwithstanding other artists sampling them regularly. Although the point may be arguable for those with complicated relationships within or with the Black church, the Clark sisters never leaving cannot be overstated as a major feat, given that so many Black artists at the time whose origins trace back to the Black church, career-wise, would eventually take a hard secular turn. The Clark sisters never left the Black church. They never diverged from Kojic, at least in form, which is a crucial point when considering their method, their vocacity, their sound, their boldness, their style, their sartorial flair that distinguishes them from really any other contemporary gospel group, and more pointedly from the status quo of Kojic gender politics, which rightly or wrongly fairly rigidly prescribes how Black women ought to perform womanhood in the context of holiness or the sanctified church. This never leaving collides with the reality of how the agency of Dr. Mattie Moss Clark, specifically her prowess as a musical phenom, was contested by the church to the point of censure. Here we have a woman who was more, I'm just gonna say, I'm not Kojic, I'm a good Baptist. Here we have a woman who was more prolific and more renowned. Last night, her daughters said she had charisma, but who was more prolific and more renowned in her witness for Christ than many, if not most, of the Kojic bishops, but was told that she could no longer sing with her daughters and maintain her role as the international music minister for the church because she was, quote, getting too big, end quote, following her performance at the Grammy Awards. While she did stop singing with her daughters, having passed all responsibility for the group to her beloved Twinkie so that she might maintain her ministry to the church, her response to the reprimanding board of elders and bishops is demonstrative of a third tenet of womanist methodology, redemptive self-love, such that in the face of brutal and prejudicial critique that threatened to dismantle her ministry, she defiantly articulated that she understood with clarity that what the Kojic patriarchy was doing to her was unjustified and only a means to crush God's power at work in her. In the face of this silencing, she decidedly announced her call to music ministry as equivalent to the call of the male clergy she stood before. In so doing, we get access to a big love that extends beyond God, herself, her music, and of course her children, but to also the folk, as Alice Walker might say, extending to the folk by way of a coercive patriarchy and its misogynoir, which position her where so many other Black church women find themselves, solidly within institutions, in this instance, the church, where they come to find a God of love and justice, but only insofar as they remain subjected to a gendered plessy logic that privileges the great Christian strong man while diminishing strong women. To be sure, This critique is often promulgated by thinkers like Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, Jacqueline Grant, Kelly Brown Douglas, Barbara Savage, Marcia Y. Riggs, and taken up in my forthcoming book, Black Woman's Burden. And it is contested by a strand of Black feminist, womanist religious thought that argues with thinkers like Cheryl Townsend Gilkes, Marla Fredericks, Carrie Day, Anthea Butler, and others, that notwithstanding the, quote, far from ideal, end quote, gender context in Black churches, especially sanctified traditions, Black women like Maddie Moss Clark, nevertheless, quote, continue to worship God and underwrite the overarching aims and missions of their local church bodies, end quote. Despite the church's imperfections and contradictions, the church enables Black women to be hopeful. We need to talk about that hope, and helps them make sense of the social worlds in which they are situated. It functions as a community of mutual support where Black women's concern for ultimate value in the world enables them to act as agents and to make meaning in church and community, despite debilitating, inhumane conditions. Through the autonomous value of, for example, as Cheryl Townsend Gilkes tells us, dual sex politics, women-centered church politics, and traditions of conflict as evidence of the significant power that Black women wield in African-American Christianity. But do they? Though distinct, I do not believe that these strands of Black feminist and womanist religious thought are inherently oppositional. Taken together, they do leave me with a final consideration of critical engagement as the fourth tenet of Black women's theological method that is evidenced in the intergenerationality, the sacred secular sonic disruption, the gospel democratization, and the sass, that is the power-filled disrespectability of women's vocational declaratives, all of which we see and more happening in the long arc of Maddie Moss Clark and the Clark sister legacy, lending themselves to the Lucan claim that there indeed shall be a performance of those things told her by the Lord. There is no question that in and through the Clark sisters, we see a distinct womanist theological method at work that guides and illumines the power that Black women wield as they execute at the highest levels in church and society. Moss Clark did not ever want good singing. She wanted excellence, Black woman excellence. Such critical methodological consideration, however, points me back to my own work on male power, gender violence, and the scandal of African-American social Christianity, which is different from the Church of God in Christ, as I am yet left wondering how Black women can embody such excellent and transformative power and yet remain bound to meager and stale Christian patriarchy that literally, as with Moss Clark, both silences and is the reason we sing. Thank you.
As folks gather their thoughts, I actually want to offer an opportunity for the panelists to speak with each other a bit. Just one through thread I saw was gender as method, right? So gendered representation, gendered mourning, gendered renunciation are some thoughts that came to mind. So just an opportunity for our distinguished panelists to speak with each other before opening up the floor for questions.
Dr. Dr. Washington, and Dr. Crawley, so good to see you, my friend. I was taken by both presentations, but especially your discussion of hope. And can you all hear me? The way that you articulated hope in relation to your own kind of embodied experience of grief in your family. Thank you for sharing that with us. I am moved by it because of my own work on embodiment. I'm wondering though, if hope is not always a balancing act between joy in the morning.
Oh, okay, I got you, sorry.
M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G.
Okay, I
right?
got you, yeah. Okay, thank you so much for that question. I should say, right, I offered this kind of context of my own experience of grief and my family's experience of grief. And I feel like, there's been so much loss and so much grief, I think, even in the nation kind of over the past few years. And I think maybe another piece of context I should add is just my broader suspicion of the aesthetic. Mm-hmm. So, right, like I'm always asking about whether the aesthetic, and especially the Black aesthetic, can do all we think it can, right? Because there is kind of this sensibility that I think pervades Black studies, that I think pervades a number of humanist disciplines and their sort of Black instantiations, right? The way that Black people take up these disciplines and methods. There's a sensibility that the aesthetic, or right, Black art, Black singing, Black music is always already kind of an intervention. It's always attesting to resistance. It's always, and so I think there is just, for me, right, what would it mean if we gave ourselves the space to sit in our pain, right? And it is for me, right, when I watch the gospel music performance, to me, that's why I connect to the music, right? Like the reason why I connect to Twinkie Clark's vocality is because there is such intensity about it, right? And we might sort of think of that intensity as catharsis, but my interest is like, what about the feeling body, right? Like what if we didn't need to make that gesture? What if we didn't need to make that kind of aesthetic movement do something for our meaning making? Like, what if we could just witness the pain in it? So, yeah.
What if we did that? I'm sorry. I'm fascinated. I mean, hope is like, it's an eschatological discourse, and I'm fascinated by how Black people, and understand how it's problematic too, right?
Sure.
But fascinated by how Black people have survived and flourished and crawled and climbed, right, in spite of it is fascinating to me. And so I'm wondering, well, what happens if we just sit there and stay there?
I mean, I think one of the things is that we might get, I mean, this is sort of what I was trying to gesture to in the conclusion, is that I wonder if we might get a richer and more rigorous Black cultural history, right? Like if we could witness the work that the aesthetic is doing that's not transcendence, like what kind of story could we tell, right? For me, like when I watch Twinkie's performance, if I think about the growl as doing something different or as being somewhat dissonant with the meaning making that the song is trying to engage in, for me, I get a fuller account of what the song is trying to do that actually resonates with how I connect to gospel. Because I think, right, like I connect to gospel because not just it gives me hope, but because it testifies to my pain.
Thank you.
Sorry, I forget that I was muted. I would like to just say, to extend the conversation about grief. I've been working on this project about the Hammond organ for literal years, and since 2005 at least. And it was 3 months ago, I was talking to a friend, and I was saying, anytime I directed a choir, I was a choir director for a very long time, I said I would cry every song that I would direct. And I said I was probably grieving. And it was a throwaway sentence. But then I said, actually, I think I just figured something out, which was the project is about trying to honor these musicians who have died of AIDS complications, and trying to think about the various things we lost when we lost them and did not honor like the fullness of their lives and sort of grieving that. And for me, sitting with grief means listening to them, listening to their genius. Like, these were musicians who were creating, there's this great book, Evidence of Being by Darius Bost, which is about the production, the cultural production of cultural workers, Black men who are dying of AIDS complications, but mostly journalists, poets, people that we think of, or it didn't include people like gospel musicians, church musicians. But reading the book gave me a real clear way to understand like the regularity and intensity with which so many musicians were recording music in the 80s and 90s as people are figuring out what AIDS is. Because for me, it felt like a lot of the recording was one trying to say, I'm here. So if this happens, that there is a record of my having existed, but also like people still describe the music that these musicians were making in 1985 as music that is still ahead of its time, before its time. And so for me, sitting with the grief actually for me means sitting with the things that they made for us to attend to, because they created it within the condition of deep uncertainty about their own existential longing, their existential despair. One can notice in a lot of these musicians, the language that they're using to describe their own existence, a lot about loneliness. There is so much, in other words, that grief isn't for me the antithesis of paying attention to what gets reductively called the aesthetic. I think the aesthetic I'm interested in is the kind that R.A. Judy is talking about in Disforming the American Canon, which is the refusal of the distinction between the aesthetic and the theoretical, or the aesthetic is the theory, the aesthetic is the practice, it is thought. And so it's like, it's not a distinct practice. And so like paying attention to Twinkie's growl is paying attention to the difficulty, but like grief is celebration and despair at the same, like she is remembering her mother, and the difficulty of singing in that moment is because of the deep love for her mom. And so like, for me, it's like always trying to account for the fact that what is there is the complexity of existence, which is so much about loving and having loved being here and having loved being in relation with others, and trying to honor that that density of existence. So yeah.
We'll open it up to the floor for any questions. Yes. Yes, the mic is coming.
Thank you to Dr. Washington, Dr. Turman, my friend, Dr. Crawley, for this beautiful, brilliant panel. I have a question for Dr. Washington. Because you cite Farah Jasmine Griffin and Daphne Brooks, I wonder, how do you put your work on the embodiment of the mourning and the grief and the sorrow of these Black women sacred musicians in conversation with some reductive ways of thinking about blues women, which seems to only sometimes lend itself to the embodied feeling of pleasure and or pain?
I guess one of my instincts is that it's not my impression that that is the way gospel music is written about. So I guess my impression is that I was encountering lots of writing about gospel that was really kind of emphasizing the importance of gospel as a message of hope, right? And the sort of unity of sort of musical composition and lyrical composition to sort of do the work of helping to develop a sort of resistive message, and a message that helps folks to kind of get beyond their sort of current position. And so I guess one of my thoughts is that it's not my impression that gospel music or gospel women have the same sort of, are written about with the same sense of afflictedness, right? It's much more, the reading that I've read about gospel is more about transcendence than about sort of injury.
Thank you all. I'm kind of staying where we are, but opening it up to anyone. I'm thinking about grief in the body. I'm thinking about how Haitian voodoo offers in its death and mourning traditions, celebration and mourning in the body, and in dancing and drumming and drinking all night, space for crying and grotesque laughing. And yet it is one of the most demonized religions in the world, traditions in the world. And I'm also thinking of what Dr. Washington said about kind of an alternate to the Christian hope of, oh, this is just somewhat temporary, or we'll see mama on the other side. And so with all that in mind, I'm also thinking of those Black folks who mourn in that way, that don't cry, that don't think about it. And I'm just wondering, what do we do? How do we hold space? I think it can be easy to say, oh, that's colonization in the Caribbean and you guys should be crying like every other Haitian, or, that's whatever we want to call it. But this is also ways people have decided to respond to death and respond to loss. And yeah, I'm just wondering, what are maybe better ways for us to hold space for folks who are operating in that way?
I appreciate the question, because part of my question about joy in mourning was to challenge the idea that these things are oppositional, that there is a circuity in them that necessitates continuity. And when you talk about Vodun, and when we think even more broadly about African diaspora and religion, we understand how that circuity of life and death works. I think we're able to get a closer understanding of that circuity than we are within the dualisms, and more accurately, the Platonic dualisms of Christianity and Western Christianity. And so the jump to assert hope as oppositional to grief, or to assert, and I think Dr. Crawley just spoke to this a moment ago, but to assert, that these things are in fact distinct, I think it's anti-Black. And so, and to your point, and rooted in a kind of Western, hierarchy and duality, that one is, better than the other. Either we ought to cry and not, be celebratory, although, tears and it's a mixed bag. And I think that Africanisms and African diaspora religions do that different thing. And indigenous religions broadly do this thing that really calls into question how we perceive what hope is and what hope feels like and what it aesthetically construed looks like. So what do we do? I think, well, that's a big question. But one of the things we can do is just make space, which I think, and Dr. Washington, you jump in here, is what's been called for in the presentation.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to make sense of a few things. I think maybe it's useful to say that I certainly am not trying to be prescriptive toward how people kind of deal with loss. I think what I am trying to do is to take seriously the body in pain, right? And I think my real objective here is like, how might we hear gospel music differently if we paid attention to the moments where its sort of performances and its aesthetic gestures might offer something more complicated than what's being offered in the word or the prose or the message. And so it isn't for me to suggest that hope disappears. It is to say that I worry something is lost when there is a refusal to take seriously, right? Like, what does it mean for the body to be enduring tremendous difficulty that might disallow me to grasp onto my hope right now, right? I think for me, what I see in that video, right, we know that Twinkie did not give up on God, right? But there is something for me about like how do we hold space for and sit in and witness the fact that by the end of that performance, the pain lingers, right? That like there is this belief, I believe that there is for Twinkie this belief in possibility and future union, and there is the love that she has for her mother, but there's also something else. And I think a part of what I'm interested in is like how writing about gospel music can take that something else even more seriously.
May I, can you all hear me? I just wanna say really quickly, when my grandfather passed away, I should know the answer to this question. I was in the first grade, so maybe like 6 years old. And I remember driving to Emporia, Virginia, and the thing that confused me more than I remember it clearly, walking into the yellow house on Wadlow Lane, I think it is. And there was the smell of fried chicken and there was laughter. And I could not compute it because I'm like, we are here for death. How is death and laughter happening at the same time? How is there sadness and the smell of food that we are going to eat because we enjoy it? It's because Black folks are complex, right? And so I really am not just sympathetic to the claim about the ways. I mean, I don't go to church no more. I think y'all know that. And I have a lot of reasons why. And one of the, I have a lot of critiques of the way that hope gets marshaled as a certain kind of languaging that refuses, particularly what you're saying, Professor Washington, a complexity of feeling in one's flesh. Like that is so true. It's kind of like at the Pentecostal church where they tell you, we got to move on. But people actually know that, no, you ain't got to move on. We're going to keep praising right now. I think that can actually be a kind of lens through which to think about even grief, where there's this idea of we need to move on. The lyrics of the song say move on. The lyrics of the song say have hope. But actually, that doesn't feel appropriate for this moment. What feels appropriate for this moment is perhaps this growl, is perhaps this laughter, is perhaps the smell of fried chicken. All of this is, I think, when Black religion, not just Black Christianity, but when Black religion and spiritual practice is produced as a social form together with others, that what we achieve is this complexity where some people might, it's literally baby sings the sermon, like laugh, cry, dance, that it is saying that has to be the way that we honor our life worlds. And so like, I think, yes, we can't fetishize hope. Like we can't fetishize hope as like feeling good. Sometimes hope is, I feel awful. I went through a breakup in 2020, right before the pandemic. 2020 is probably the worst year I've ever had in my life. And I felt a deep sense of hope because I was able to talk to friends honestly about how horrible it felt every single day. And and it's because it was allowed to breathe. Literally, it was given space. That the actual it's not like a presidential campaign hope slogan, but it's a kind of how can we allow for the complexity of the uncertainty of human existence and the great mysterious beyond of this universe that keeps expanding that we don't understand. How can we allow the deep feeling that we have to be felt each and every moment? And I think that Black religion gives us resources for honoring that. And I hear that what you're saying is Twinkie in that moment is connecting to that difficulty, to that complexity, and we have to be willing to sit with that. I'm done, sorry.
Thank you. Can we give a round of applause to this panel? Our schedule is changing. We're just about out of time because we had such a time over with the clock teachers of the master class. But I want to invite all of the panelists who are still here from the whole day to join the podium, to join the dais, I guess you can call it, just for a little talk back as we prepare to wrap up. We'll go a couple minutes past the hour and then we will get out of this space and let you all go on and have a wonderful evening. As they come, I will share, I was thinking this afternoon in the masterclass about the multiplicity, the dissonance between the words and the musical arrangements that are often, right, intoned, or maybe about their interest in something beyond the overt meaning of the words, right? Because the words kind of dissolve when they take this syllable and repeat it 20 times or do this other thing to it, right? There is some depth of meaning and a feeling that was hard to put into words this afternoon, and I think is the reason we've been able to wrestle so productively from all the vantage points that the speakers of the entire program have talked about, from theology and anthropology and English and musicology and so forth. I am biased, but I feel that this is one of the greatest convenings I've ever been a part of, and it is thanks in no small part to the brilliance of each individual presenter. And so we've got to get out of here really quickly. So I just want to ask you one question before I call you for the edited volume that somebody told me I had to do this morning. I just want to know what you are going to leave thinking about. And you can sort of answer in any order that you want. And as you gather your thoughts, I'm going to, I guess, go first, just so you can have a second to get yourself together. I think I'm going to leave thinking about the way the pursuit of polish was about. Professor Wright, we want you up here. I didn't see you. The way the pursuit of polish was about this sanctification, about, right, the pursuit of holiness, and sound was the realm in which to make that achievement obvious, available, palpable, recordable, right? In the temporality that you could witness and replay over and over again. It's a kind of different time scale than a life cycle when you would otherwise be performing or showing or evidencing this kind of transformation. That's something I'm going to be thinking about for the next 2 weeks of my class on the Women of the Gospel, how to connect Maddie Moss Clark's legacy in sound to the broader theological framework from which she emerged and that she helped to transform. And the rest of you can go in any order you want to. I won't call on you.
I can go first. So a couple years ago, I started therapy, and I had this wonderful psychiatrist, 20 years older Black lady. And it just so happened that she was familiar with the Church of God in Christ in the Sanctified Church, of which I grew up in. And I started off talking about the usual things, you know, how I grew up, of my mom, my dad, my brothers, my brother, my family. And she was like, but let's go back to the Kojic. You grew up around that space? And I was like, yes, ma'am. And she was like, you have issues with perfectionism. And that idea of sanctification and perfectionism could be the very thing that's breaking you in this moment. So as I sat and listened this entire week, and I did oral histories with them yesterday, and listened to Twinkie and the sisters talk about the excellence and the perfectionism. When you look at Twinkie when she says that, and I wanna hold Dr. Washington up here, when you look at Twinkie when she talks about it, there's a way that she talks about it that's kind of heavy and heavier than her sisters. And I identify with how she feels, like the affect of it when she sits in it. So when I want to sit and think deeper about that idea of perfectionism and that ascent to holiness and sanctification that is held up as the barometer of what makes the Clark sisters great, but that could also very well be something that hurts too.
I think for me, was somebody else going to say? Oh, what for me, what stands out is this conversation around passing down traditions, and to see the ways in which that happened, not only with Maddie Moss Clark to her daughters, but then her daughters, we saw it in the film, to their children. And then Guthrie Ramsey's keynote address, and he made this comment as he was talking about passing this tradition down to his own children. He says, for people who have been oppressed, we love to see the passing down of traditions. We like to see that we're going to survive. And then to have that reinforced during the master class, especially with the first student who was singing. And then Dorinda Clark went up to her and started singing in her ear to help instruct her on how to do the thing, to make it into the song that it could be. It was just incredibly powerful. And so I think one of the key takeaways for me is the importance of the passing down of traditions.
I'm going to go away from here as a sociologist, looking at the connectedness across a variety of organizational spaces that Dr. Maddie Moss Clark and the Clark sisters both embody and also illuminate in terms of others who have done it. So it's like all of a sudden seeing a valley of dry bones that have a lot of connections.
I guess I'll say, I watched most of today. I watched the keynote as well. I saw the early panel and was really thankful to be able to at least see the things virtually. I was really, really reticent to write anything. I've written, things lovingly about the Clark sisters and Twinkie Clark and NPR. I've written more critical things and was really struggling with what I could say, given the nature of the project that I'm doing and the theological convictions of the folks that I'm thinking with. And I was really thankful to have to sit down and actually think about it, because one of the things that became really, really clear to me as I was writing and thinking is that, Judith Castleberry's Labor of Faith, I talk about all the time. It's my favorite book of the last 10 years because it cracked open my mind in terms of Black women in labor in the church and real, and the way labor is gendered. It's things that you kind of know, but she kind of really, really illustrated it for me. And thinking with her text and thinking about what Twinkie was saying at the funeral really gave me a real way to finally say, to answer the question, how are Black women a part of the project that you're doing? Because the erasure of Black women is happening at the same time that there's this deep desire to masculinize the music department. And so yes. I am so thankful that I had to like sit down and really, really think about it because I knew I wanted to talk about Twinkie and her musicianship and her mom and all the women musicians who have made me possible and just struggle to do it, but really, really, and just hearing the ways that you all have talked about like Maddie Moss Clark and her history of playing and being classically trained is just, you know, having it narrated from someone else is really important. So I'm really, really thankful. And I'm thankful for Amber and all the work that she's done on Twitter lately.
I think so. One thing I was noticing is that many folks who showed clips or made reference to particular Clark sisters music did so with live performance. So I am sort of interested in the prevalence of kind of the live performance as our kind of reference through which presumably we think one best understands what the Clark sisters do and how they do it. And I think I'm also relatedly thinking about Professor Ramsey's articulation of musical performance as a social realization of our aspirations. So I'm thinking about sort of gospel music and liveness and what it is about live performance that that captures the spirit of what gospel music is trying to do that recorded music might not.
Well, if I can say that the panelists who talk about the womanist aspects of gospel music in the midst of the patriarchal presence everywhere. One of my colleagues said I should write something about the 40 years I've been in gospel radio, because there are days, well, there used to be just a couple of charts. Now there are umpteen charts. And when I look through them and I see there are days when 75 to 80% of those on the list are men. And it's not that I don't think many of them aren't good. It's just I'm thinking, where are these women? Why aren't they getting the same attention and the same support that they are? The other thing that I'll be thinking about has to do with my own sense of grappling with my own mother's death. It was 5 years ago. She was singing CeCe Winans' Blessed Assurance that she left out of here, because she had been a musician her entire 91 years. And so even though she had Alzheimer's, she was still thinking about it. So I was smiling, but I was crying at the same time. And to this day, I still have moments when I think about that. And I'm glad that you talk about the fact that it doesn't all have to be about I'm happy, you know, or I'm really sad. You can be both. It's okay. And thank you, Professor Crawley. And yeah, we could still have the chicken in the room at the same time too.
I think that I am, first of all, I'm fascinated by Maddie Moss Clark.
Yes.
I'm fascinated by her. And I don't want to, I certainly know that perfection cannot be presumed and that she has a very contested identity on a number of fronts. But I leave here thinking about her and thinking about Black mothering. And I think the capacities, I think that Black mothers have to save lives and to save their children's lives. I mean, that's arguable, but also Emily Towns once wrote this to me. She said, "The life you save echoes into future generations." And thinking about how the work of Maddie Moss Clark touched me in my 10 or 12-year-old bedroom through Karen Clark and Kiki, right? Who in my mind was like my best friend back in, like how Black motherhood and mothering in kind of its various dimensions is salvific. And I don't want to read that Christologically, certainly, right? Because people take issue with me on that, but it's a revolutionary act. And I think I'm so taken by Maddie Moss Clark because of her complexities in that regard. And yet the way she continues to echo. So.
Last word goes to Professor Almeda Wright.
Benediction. Not at all. The conversation today has been so rich. And so I'm so grateful for the ability to have sat with and to reflect on Dr. Maddie Moss Clark, but also Bishop Maddie Clark Ramsey, or Moss Ramsey, and to really think about the intergenerational nature of these Black women leaders, and the way that legacy continues. Because I mean, it's so interesting for me to see each generation, but also even thinking farther out with like Jay Moss and other folks that are part of that same tree. That's the thing that I'm still wrestling with, because I have to hold that together with what does it mean for us in our visions of authoritarianism. And like, are there ways that legacies can continue that are not authoritative, or that are authoritative in ways that are not problematic? And so that's what I'm still trying to tease out as we leave today.
Well, I'll be calling all of you.
And Dr.
We get
Cheryl,
one big,
and
sorry, go on. Yes, yes.
I spoke already. You did? Oh.
Okay. One big round of applause for this amazing